I want to talk about trauma, grief, and dissociation, and specifically dissociative states. The subject of trauma has been getting a lot of attention in the media, online, for a long time, but especially lately. And I do think the reason for that is there's just overall a little bit more awareness about mental health in the 21st century. People have become aware of the fact that we're sort of in an age where we're facing a crisis. More and more people experience profound depression, anxiety, and of course trauma. People are feeling more and more traumatized. And I do think that there is a connection between this experience, this rising experience, and our modern lifestyle. And the primary reason for this, in my opinion, is our modern lifestyle is extremely conducive to getting into dissociative states. Now that's the primary thing I want to focus on. Dissociative states are usually a side effect of trauma or grief, especially trauma. It's actually something I myself know quite a bit about. I've experienced a lot of dissociative states over the years. I've spent sometimes prolonged periods of time being in this kind of state. And I understand, because of that, just exactly how difficult it is, one, to describe the experience, two, to even know what's happening in the first place, and three, most of all, to get out of this state. Because once you're in it, you kind of become less aware of what's happening, less aware of yourself, your own feelings, even your own surroundings, your own body. You're working at an extreme disadvantage, and it's a lot harder to think your way out of it than it might be for some other things. Depression is kind of similar. Depression is one of those states where once you're in it, you can't just think your way out of it. At least most people can't. Again, once you're in that state, you're operating at a disadvantage. You're already deeply entrenched in this debilitating, confusing mental structure that is, in a way, designed to prevent you from using the full range of your psychological ability, and sometimes even physical ability. Trauma is kind of like that, but it's a little bit more insidious. It affects us on a much deeper level, and it's a lot harder to get out of. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how it happens, and just things about trauma that a lot of people don't really understand, that I think might be helpful if you yourself or someone you know is dealing with this kind of dissociative state associated with trauma. One of the most important things to understand about trauma and what it means to recover from trauma is that you don't recover from trauma. However, that does not mean that you can't go back to a way of life that's conducive to your happiness. It does not mean that you can't reclaim the parts of your life that you feel have been either taken away from you or badly damaged. For example, as I talked about in some of my other videos, when you get into a dissociative state, especially one caused by trauma, it very frequently prevents you from being as creative as you used to be. Now that doesn't happen for everybody. Some people even get more creative as a result. But for the most part, it limits the psyche's capacity for exploration. It limits the psyche's ability to wander in some of the directions that might be a little bit more authentic to the person. So in that situation, recovering from trauma does allow you to reclaim those portions of the psyche, but it doesn't happen the way that most people think it ought to. It doesn't happen in an intuitive way, or at least not immediately intuitive. The road to recovery is very twisted and convoluted and strange. The primary thing that I think needs to be understood is that recovering from trauma and dissociative states related to trauma, rather than thinking of it as a recovery, it's much better to think of it as a transformation. You won't be getting better. You will be transforming into a new version of yourself, which is just as powerful and capable and dynamic as the previous version of self. Even if you've managed to get through this life relatively unscathed, at some point you've definitely become aware of the fact that some eras or some chapters of the life simply close. And there's an incredibly melancholy feeling that accompanies this realization. People who've experienced trauma experience that on a much higher level. I guess what I want to say is trauma and grief are very, very similar. People who experience trauma go through a grieving process. Similarly, people who are grieving can experience trauma. I think it's also important to note that a lot more people are traumatized than the people who are aware that they are traumatized. Trauma can happen from almost anything. For some people, it's just caused by one event or a series of events. Sometimes people can experience trauma from things that they assume shouldn't traumatize them. Perhaps their parents allow them to watch a movie when they're a child that they're too young to watch. Maybe it's a horror film or something like that, and it sticks in their mind. For some children, something like that, it will occupy space within their psyches for the rest of their lives, and they don't even realize it. And that's just true in general. Most of us have all these things in our minds that we're not fully aware of. We're not aware that they're affecting us. Sometimes we've buried the memory and forgotten about it. Or, more frequently, we've distracted ourselves from it. And because of that, we really don't get how much we're hurting, but we have no idea. And I think the majority of traumatized people are in that boat. They're operating at less than optimal capacity without really understanding that that's what's happening. In fact, an awful lot of people assume that this is just what growing up means. They, unfortunately, have not been taught. They haven't had the opportunity to learn that that's not what growing up means. Growing up is supposed to mean expanding inward, becoming larger, becoming more empowered, occupying more space, and it means that that space is going to become more and more useful, more and more versatile. And at this point, I know I'm kind of repeating myself because my last two videos like this talked about it, but there is a direct correlation between the way we think, the way we use our minds, and how free and expansive versus limiting and rigid, and what we've experienced as a child, or sometimes older. Young children are usually very talented when it comes to divergent thinking, for example. Young children will see multiple ways of looking at something. They'll go completely left field. They'll even find new ways of looking at the question, let alone the answer. If you give them a simple problem, they might give you a simple solution that you're expecting. They might give you a completely amazing or ridiculous solution, or they might completely reframe the question. And to them, that's simple. They don't have to work to get into that state. What a lot of people don't understand is that this is not a quality of being young. This is a quality of being human. And one of the primary ways that people tend to get disconnected from it is from accruing traumas. Now, I was mentioning before that trauma can come from a bunch of things. Something we take for granted is that sometimes just having a bunch of small experiences can cause as much pain and suffering and as much dissociation, which I'll be returning to later, as having a car accident or some very terrible single event. So, for example, if you grew up in a household and you had extremely rigid parents, always slapping you down, always kind of scoffing at your creative ideas, if you were made to feel small, insignificant, like your feelings didn't matter, even if it's just a bunch of small events, even if it's just little kind of passive-aggressive things, if you experience something like this for a long period of time repeatedly, it chips away at the framework of your well-being. So, for example, you might say, imagine that your self-esteem or your sense of your reality being stable is kind of like a scaffolding. It's made of wood. You might have some very large, terrible thing happen, and that would strike the wood, perhaps even breaking some of the beams, and you would experience a profound loss of safety. But if you, say, grew up in a household where you were always listening to small little insults, small little put-downs from a loved one, or really anyone, that foundation is kind of like it's been slowly eaten away by termites, and it will become just as structurally unsound, if not more. And of course, if you're one of the many unlucky people who've experienced both, if you've experienced a lack of stability in your everyday life, and you've had single events happen to you that were life-changing, your sense of safety or self-esteem will be so precarious that you will have gone above and beyond to distract yourself in any way possible. Let's talk more directly about the way trauma affects the mind. I'm going to use a small kingdom or a small nation or a village as a metaphor. This nation is your mind or your psyche. Normally, all the parts of this nation talk to one another. They're all connected. You can get anywhere from anywhere. There's a real sense of everything being confluent and cohesive. Inside this little kingdom, nothing feels especially forbidden. Nothing feels like it's unusable per se. You have a real sense that all of it belongs to you. That even if you're not inclined to use a certain portion of it, there's still a sense that you're at least allowed to look at it, that you're at least allowed to go near it. That's the default state of being for most people. There's no sense that any part of this village is illegitimate or inaccessible, or in any way, shape, and form bad or unworthy. Everything in it belongs. Everything in it has a purpose, even if that purpose isn't obvious, even if you never, and you probably never would, think about what the purpose of all these parts are. There's kind of a default state of everything having purpose and meaning. Now, with that in mind, there will always be parts of the landscape that are more fruitful than others. We're all going to have natural talents, natural preferences. We may be more or less social. That's normal. You don't have to be traumatized to not feel very social, for instance. Similarly, if there's some subject that you really hated in school or that you just can't wrap your head around, although I'm not saying it's impossible you'll ever be good at it, there is a good chance that without having negative experiences, you might give up on it left to your own devices. And that is normal to some extent. It is normal to gravitate and migrate towards the things that are immediately fruitful. Of course, someone who's psychologically healthy, as they get older, will eventually start to want to branch out. They'll start to want to harvest the crops that they don't enjoy growing as much or that they have difficulty growing. They might be willing to put in the effort. Now, when we get traumatized, what we tend to experience is that one or more of those regions, let's say portions of the village or the little kingdom, get overrun. Sometimes we experience it almost like suddenly there's an infestation. The place feels chaotic, messy. Sometimes we feel like there's even some sort of beast or monster guarding the place. Like if we go near that portion of the psyche, this thing will get us. And we experience this as a frantic need to avoid. And this is before dissociation really takes hold, what I'm describing. What we don't realize and what a lot of people don't understand, that portion of the village, it's not just overrun, it's actually getting replaced. That portion of the village is due to transform into something else, perhaps something comparable. But the thing is, because we're so frightened and we have so many often ingenious ways of avoiding pain and struggle, we usually, the tendency is to abandon that part of the village. So, as I've stated, often what we're inclined to do is we start avoiding those places altogether. We find more and more reasons not to go to that park or not to think about that childhood friend, or not to listen to that song, or not to get into those situations. We're really, really good at it. It starts with the external physical things. As many of you are familiar with that concept, because that's very hot in the media right now. Now, I mentioned before how some parts of that inner landscape are more fruitful than others. Some of them are immediately useful to us, immediately valued by us, and some of them less so. Sometimes when we experience painful things, we are lucky in that we don't really associate them with important parts of our lives or important people, or they don't directly, or at least don't seem to directly overlap with the things that we think make us quintessentially ourselves. We don't really have a strong sense of losing part of ourself in those circumstances. But when trauma affects what we would consider to be a fruitful part of the inner landscape, we become especially debilitated. The unfortunate thing is, more often than not, just due to human nature, it is a fruitful part of the landscape that's being affected. For instance, I mentioned creativity. Creativity is something that typically involves deep, passionate emotions. Well, unsurprisingly, the parts of us that are the most vulnerable are the parts that we invest the most emotion into. These are the things that empower us. But they're also the parts of us that tend to be a little bit fragile in another sense. Your creative spirit. The part of you that can easily fall in love. The part of you that's still a child. These are the parts of the psyche that you might say remain open. So what happens when that part takes a hit? We retreat. We retreat into the meadow, into the distance. We find new ways of operating. Sometimes we move into the less fruitful parts of the village that I described earlier. Sometimes we make lemonade, so to speak. Sometimes we even think we're embracing the things that have happened to us, and some of the time we're right. A lot of the time, although we're trying to make the best of things, we are ultimately still avoiding the thing. And that thing isn't going to go away. It's going to continue to exist in the background. It's going to continue to cause pain, and it's going to continue to debilitate us and prevent us from using the parts of our psyche that we most need. This is also what causes us to start the process of compartmentalization. And this is where dissociation really starts to become a problem. So everyone who's traumatized is likely to dissociate a little bit. In fact, even people who aren't traumatized can get dissociated. If I could say that there was one primary definition of dissociation and dissociative states, it would be when the inner parts of the mind, or the inner village, or the inner kingdom, or whatever, when the portions of that place are not communicating, and more importantly, when they become compartmentalized. If a mind is ordinarily shaped like a village, every place has a purpose, all the places are meant to be accessible, a traumatized mind is shaped more like a labyrinth. Everything is a little more inconvenient. There are walls everywhere. The divides don't really make a whole lot of sense. And usually you're not able to see very much of the labyrinth at a time. The nature of dissociation is that we construct extremely elaborate mechanisms to prevent us from observing ourselves or experiencing part of ourselves. And this seems like a really good idea. It seems like a really good idea if we don't cry anymore, or if we feel safe, and believe me, you don't feel safe, but if you think you feel safe, and you think you're protected from getting hurt again, or whatever it is, you are also extremely, extremely limited. You're sitting in a place where you can only see a tiny portion of the horizon, where there's very little intercommunication taking place, and where you have to jump through hoops just to get through the day. Now, the more dissociated you are, the more unconscious this whole thing starts to get, and the harder it will be to get out of it. And when it gets very unconscious, the person is pretty much on autopilot all the time. They become what many would describe as kind of robotic on the inside. They become less and less aware of their surroundings, less aware of their feelings, their body. All of these things are likely, but different people experience different proportions of these effects. In my own case, the most common experience that I had was that I was no longer aware of my own body. I would feel almost like my body didn't exist. Like I would be going through my day and everything exists up here. This is my whole life up here. Everything that's going on with any discomfort I'm feeling or even anxiety I'm feeling that's manifesting physically, I would be tuning that out because it was just too much. It was not helpful. I wanted to be creating all the time. I wanted to be socializing, and I could only do these things if I had a significant portion of my mind switched off. It took me years of practice to learn to recognize when I was getting more dissociated, to learn to tune back into my body, and to learn what was necessary in my case to reduce the stress that was causing me to do this in the first place. When a person is traumatized or grief-stricken, but more so of trauma, what they experience is their core persona, which I said is ordinarily whole, splits. And it can get very complicated very fast. Because the more difficulty the person has operating in that mode, the more chances there are for the person to compartmentalize further. Ordinarily, there are always going to be many, many versions of self. There's going to be more protective voices, productive voices, more caring, or more social, or more creative, or more isolated. All of these parts of the selves are supposed to be there. Nobody's just one person. We do change from day to day. When you're dissociated, though, you change between these masks in a way that is not helpful to you. It might seem helpful in the short term sometimes because it might help you get through a busy day at work, or it might help you get through social situations that you don't want to do or you don't feel well enough to do or something like that. But the thing is, you're actually giving yourself the illusion of control when you're doing this. You're giving yourself a pretend version of you that can do these tasks for you. You're assigning macros and gambits and programming yourself. But the more you program yourself, the less self there actually is. What it means to be you, what it means to be human, is to have this canvas, this holodeck of imagination where you can go in any direction, where it doesn't matter what version of you are, where whatever version of you happen to be, truly, authentically, is the right one. The more we try to control this, the more we compartmentalize and create fractured personae in order to deal with our inability to use situation X with situation X's personality, the more specific and rigid and context-sensitive our interactions become. And it's an inevitability that people who end up in that situation are going to have extreme moments of panic. They're going to break down. They're going to experience what I would describe as a psychological blue screen, where they're stuck in a loop. They're having cognitive dissonance. They have two or more things happening inside at the same time that are contradictory, and it creates more and more and more chaos in the mind. And just like with a computer, that causes you to freeze. It causes you to either break down and have a panic attack and lose control entirely, or it causes you to become more dissociated to the point where you switch off and you become so numb that you don't even know who you are. And I've experienced both of these things before. I would say that the latter is the one that used to get me more, though. When I had a panic attack, nobody even knew I was having one, because I would just go very quiet and it would be very confusing, very abstract. And the absolute worst thing was having to express emotions. When I'd get into these states, I would actually have to train myself how to interact with people, how to do the things that actually felt natural to me. It's like I didn't have a sun in my sky, so I had to construct a fake glowing light source that I could use for temporary self-expression. The only thing is, every time we do this, every time we make these fractured personae in order to interact and deal with these blue screens or whatever debilitating experiences we have, the more it depletes our life energy, the more tired we get. It's an incredible amount of work because you're constantly swimming upstream. Everything you're doing when you get into these states is working against your true nature. I'm going to contradict myself now a little bit, but hear me out. It is our true nature also to respond to trauma and grief in this way. That is part of the human experience. But dissociation, by its nature, limits your humanness. It limits many, many different portions of you that are also natural. And these things, I would describe them almost like viruses. I would describe it as a kind of unhelpful, imperfect part of evolution that we're still trying to evolve away from. These processes can run rampant in the mind and they can take over. And it's very important for us not only to recognize when they're happening, and to get to know the different aspects and angles of these processes. How do they work? How long do they take? What's the best thing you can do when you know it's happening? What's the worst thing you can do when you know it's happening, etc. So, for example, I figured out, and unfortunately it took me years to figure out, when I had these blue screen moments, the worst thing for me, that for some reason I was repeatedly subjecting myself to, being in a situation where somebody expected me to respond in a certain way. When I was having this, it's almost like that part of me was just completely invisible. I had no idea what I was feeling. Therefore I had no idea how to respond. Because of my nature, I don't like to respond if it doesn't feel honest or accurate to what's actually going on. So it would actually cause me to retreat deeper into myself because this additional stress was happening. So one of the things I had to do was I had to learn to recognize, oh, okay, this is happening. I'm freezing. I learned that the best thing I could do is not engage, especially in an emotional discussion. And I was able to describe my inner situation in such a manner that my loved ones wouldn't take it personally if I couldn't respond to them, or if I just needed a couple minutes alone. And this took a lot of anxiety away from me because I used to feel like I owed people an explanation, and I felt like I had to make sure everybody was okay, make sure everybody was happy. But after a point, it got to a point where that wasn't possible because I was ignoring my own needs for so long. Kind of like my analogy with the fake light source, it was tapping into a limited power source instead of using my default native power source with which I was too dissociated to properly interact. An important thing to understand with trauma-related dissociation is that you can't really do much about it. There are things you can do that are more or less helpful, but the most important thing to understand is that you just have to ride it out. And the more we try to fix ourselves or find immediate solutions, oftentimes the worse we're going to feel. My suggestion to anybody who suffers from dissociation is if you can find anything at all, if there's something you can think of that you find grounding, anything that seems like an anchor, that's your go-to. Usually when it's actually happening, just due to the nature of dissociation, you usually forget. You forget what your anchor is, you forget how everything works. If you live with a loved one or there's someone you spend a lot of time with who's familiar with your psychological state, you can teach them what your grounding anchor is and what your triggers are. And for example, some people when they're dissociated do not want to be touched. That's usually pretty common. But for some people, a hug actually helps quite a lot. If you already know this about yourself, it's a really good idea to write this stuff down. Write down what makes it worse. Give that to your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whoever you're with. And even just to yourself. So for example, for me, one of the things I find most helpful when I'm dissociated is listening to music, especially music that brings me to a time in my childhood that I was particularly happy, that I don't associate with anything negative. Another thing that I find kind of helpful is listening to my own music, because it brings me to the state of mind I was in when I created it. And as I talked about in my other videos, being creative is usually synonymous with being more open and more receptive and just more familiar and connected to yourself. I find that sometimes when I look at or read or listen to my own creations, it connects me to more fruitful portions of the psyche that are still easy for me to access and use. Now, this obviously isn't going to work for everybody, but even the most traumatized person typically has one or two things that even if they don't make you feel good, they might make you feel normal. You might not be able to feel safe, but you can feel anchored, and sometimes that's the best you can do. You just have to endure the waves. Although this feeling can be very unbearable, having that anchor, having that one little star in the middle of the void, that one lighthouse in the middle of the ocean, maybe while you're dissociated you won't know what to do, maybe you don't even know what to do now. But because this is a long-term thing for a lot of people, wait for that one moment where you feel a little bit better, a little bit more in touch with yourself, where you're thinking a little more clearly, and during that time, try to see if you can figure out what is that lighthouse for you? What is that thing that you might forget about while you're dissociated? And see if you can find a way to remind yourself of it. Maybe even have a picture of it on your wall, or maybe on your phone or on your computer, just have something ready on the desktop that might help you. Another thing that's extremely important to understand when dealing with trauma-related dissociation is that you need to go with the flow. Now, I know that's sort of a cheesy expression, but remember how I mentioned that your mind becomes more like a labyrinth? And of course, that means it's got pitfalls, it's got all kinds of crazy contraptions and traps and monsters. It's a video game dungeon. Your mind is a video game dungeon. And thinking of it like that, at least for me, it actually kind of helps. It gives me a frame of reference. I'm sure it's not surprising to very many people that people who experience grief, trauma, and dissociation very, very frequently become attached to fantasy. In fact, fantasy can be used destructively to make people dissociate more. The good news is it can also be used constructively, because anything you can use as a parallel for your mind, as a metaphor for your psyche, can be used to help guide yourself out of these states. Your hero right now is somewhere inside that labyrinth, in that dungeon. Your hero's lost. What needs to happen is your hero needs to move around according to the logic of that labyrinth. Your hero needs to use whatever tools are naturally there. And you need to accept that it's not going to be linear. It's not going to be logical, at least immediately. Everything's just kind of scrambled and frayed. You have to just kind of go here if it wants to go here, go there if it wants to go there. It won't be immediately recognizable to you. But if you spend a lot of time getting to know the shape of your wounded psyche, you can become better and better at navigating it. You can start mapping it. You can start understanding where the pitfalls are and what connects to what. This is how you actually make lemonade. You don't make lemonade by saying, okay, I'm stuck in this room now. I guess I'll learn to accept this room for the rest of my life. Look around, poke around, explore the confines of that room. You're not trapped. It's just really easy to get complacent and confused when we get into these situations. So imagine that you're that hero. You're the hero who's trapped in the labyrinth. You don't have to know what the goal is. You don't have to make the labyrinth into something else. You don't have to change anything. You just have to step into that role. You also need to understand that once you're already in that situation, you're not going to find a perfect solution. You're not going to find a pain-free solution. You will have to make lemonade in the negative sense a little bit, but it doesn't have to be permanent. We are chimerical beings internally. We're supposed to transform. We're supposed to adapt. And you can apply that instinct to this situation. And if you do it willingly, if you do it with intent, instead of just letting your unconscious mind do it for you, you can ask yourself, who do I need to be right now? Not just who can I be that will let me stop feeling this way, or who can I be that will let me get this work done. Apply that not just to your external life, not just to try to make things more convenient in the present. Apply that internally. Ask yourself, who must I become if I need to navigate this desert? If I need to walk through this prison? Who do I need to be to melt the ice? What kind of person can do this? What kind of person do I need right now? What kind of person would be very comforting to me? And see if you can locate that within your own mind. Try to find the you version of that helpful ally. See if you can access the part of your mind that's capable of imagining that character. Because if you can imagine that character, it means that part of that character is in you. Maybe you're feeling a profound state of meaninglessness. Maybe you're feeling like you just don't care, or like you don't know who you are anymore, or you can't figure out what your purpose is. Well, in that case, ask yourself, who would I like to talk to? Who do I need to see? Maybe you need to picture some kind of wise, ethereal sage. In a situation like that, sometimes it's helpful to just imagine yourself walking into some ancient, beautiful temple somewhere, some castle, somewhere you associate with knowledge and power and resource, and picture some wise sage standing at the end of a thoroughfare, someone with all the world's knowledge, somebody whose job it is to be a mentor for lost young heroes. Imagine the way that person makes you feel. Imagine how safe you are around that person, how much you respect them, how much you look up to them. Imagine what they look like, the way they carry themselves. In fact, just try and do that now. Picture yourself walking through that thoroughfare. At the end of a road, there's a person standing there. You've never seen anyone who radiated so much wisdom, so much serenity. As you look into their eyes, you see all the universe in a single glance, as though they know everything, as though they've seen everything. You sense both profound joy and profound sadness from them. Imagine what they're wearing. Imagine the way they stand. See if you can see anything in their hands, anything they're holding. And now that you've imagined that person's in you. That's a part of you. And more than this, regardless of the prompts I've given you, you weren't at any point capable of picturing anything that wasn't directly connected to you and who you are. That sage character is a part of you. Try to access that persona. So that's just one specific example of what I'm talking about. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the imagination is a playground. The imagination is like a holodeck. The mind is like a holodeck. And if we start to look at it that way, if we start to go out of our way to access those parts of the mind, if we start to imagine even our trauma and even our pain as objects within this landscape, objects that can be interacted with, that can be examined, we'll actually gain a lot of the control we've lost. The only thing that usually prevents us from progressing when we're trying to heal ourselves, assuming that the traumatic events are over externally, is our inability to make ourselves conscious of these things within our mind. It's our inability to picture these things directly, to interact with them. It's the fact that we picture these things as forbidden, separate, wholly inaccessible nightmares within the dreamscape. But the thing is, every single thing in your dreamscape is yours. You own it. You own that nightmare. If something terrible happened to you, that's in no way your fault. And no, you probably weren't able to control it at all, or at least not to an extent that would have protected you. However, now that it's over, perhaps you'll always be in pain. Perhaps you'll always have difficulty with certain triggers. But it is possible to turn that inner landscape into something beautiful. See the art in the moment. Let me give you another example. There have been a few times when I've experienced incredibly hot summers. Summers that were just unbelievably, grossly, horribly hot, where no matter what you do, you're too warm, where your fan blows hot air at you. Many of us have experienced that. I remember this one year where that was happening, and I suddenly had this inspired thought that I'm in a desert level, or I'm in a desert part of a story. I thought, well, look at this. Of course it's hot. It's hot because I'm in this desert. I've got to pass through it. This is part of my quest. And I remember this incredible sense of transformation where suddenly the fact that everywhere was so warm and horribly so became very, very beautiful. It was something that was exciting. I felt like I was part of something. I felt like I was an integral part of a very interesting story. Suddenly, I had this deep sense that it was supposed to be hot. I was supposed to be warm. And there was a kind of joy that came with that feeling, that realization. And I'll give another example. I like Star Trek rather a lot, and I have had acupuncture done before. And at one point I had a needle put into the palm of my hand, and let me tell you, that was excruciating. It really, really hurt. And in a different session, I was going to have a needle in the palm of the hand again, and I was dreading it. But then I thought of these moments in Star Trek when these Klingon characters would cut the palm of their hand in order to prove how brave they were or how committed they were. And you would get a group of them and they would all kind of bleed into a bucket. And as much as I don't want to do that, I've often wondered while I was watching it, if I was in that situation, would I be brave enough to do it too? And I always kind of thought, well, I would if I had to, but ooh, I would hate that. Well, I had the needle in my hand, because the pain spreads, I imagined I was doing the ritual, and it didn't really hurt anymore. I mean, it kind of hurt, but the pain turned into something else. Something else took over. The pain felt like it was part of a story, something that was supposed to be there. When you get dissociated and you sink into that strange underworld of the psyche, you can try this. You can just tell yourself, okay, right now I'm in a dungeon. And accept this. Accept this as a normal part of your life. And even find joy in it. Find joy in the fact that you're this brave adventurer who regularly goes into dungeons. You've gone through them lots of times. You'll do it again. And you do have what it takes. You can get through it. And if you feel lost or trapped or like you're struggling, just remember that it might even just be that you didn't understand what was happening. Now that you know that it's a dungeon, now that you expect it to be a dungeon, you can actually change it a bit more. You can think of it differently. You can think of it as a valid part of the experience, a valid part of the adventure. This is a natural thing that's happening to me as a result of my life. It is unpleasant, but it's something that I can learn a lot from. It's something that I can use to fuel my creativity. It's something that I can use to turn into a beautiful story. So in lieu of that, another thing you can do is to imagine yourself as a character in a story more directly. So what I mean by that is, okay, picture this. Imagine you're given this novel, and the novel is about a character who's exactly like you. They go through the same things you do. Even if your life's really boring, even if nothing happens to you, there's still going to be a novel about it. And I want you to imagine that it's beautifully written, that it's one of the most amazing writers you've ever read, that every single paragraph is expressed in this most gorgeous way, and you can't put it down. And the character goes through all these things, but the writer describes them in so much detail. It's so vivid. Even if your character's just sitting in a waiting room and they're so bored, the writer describes this waiting room in a way that you can't help smiling at. They describe how bland everything is, how tepid everything is, the brown carpet, the beige walls, the old musty magazines, the depressing fluorescent lights, a dying plant in the corner. They describe it in this way that makes it feel really interesting and alive. It's so ugly that it's beautiful. It's so boring that it's interesting. Or maybe your character goes to a party and they don't talk to anybody there and they end up regretting wasting their evening just sitting there in the corner. And then the book describes in depth their emotional state as they're on the way home. This abstract internal dialogue about how they feel that they wasted the night. It goes into intimate detail. And when you read this, you can't stop turning the pages because you're just so impressed with this book's ability to really, really get into this character's head. And you care for this character. You care for their struggles. You care for how boring their life is or how painful it is. So if you can imagine that novel, which I'm sure a lot of you can learn to become fond of your character, fond of your story. So next time you're dissociated, try to imagine that your character is just in one of these situations. They're underground. They can't feel as much because there's not as much light where they are, or there's not enough room. They're in a situation where they're struggling in some way. You can explore this. You can be that character, because you are that character. Everything that's happening to them is happening to you. And you can even learn to see that situation as beautiful, as interesting, as something that's a valid part of your experience. A lot of people who do this kind of inner work find that there's a kind of pleasure in it. There's a kind of pleasure in exploring these landscapes. We do it all the time when we project ourselves into fantasy. And if you are doing this, as I say, deliberately, with wisdom, you can get a lot farther than you might think. The one thing that you can always do, that you always can control, and perhaps always should control, is the way you frame things. The way you frame situations, the way you frame your experience, your perception. You can learn to frame things in ways that you will find beautiful, that you will find valid, that you will be willing to look at. You will find ways to enjoy all the art, all the paintings, all the music that's wrought of your experience, of your pain and suffering, of your joy. Every single thing that you are, everything that's happened to you, everything you're feeling in the moment. All of these things can be beautiful. All of these things you can feel affection toward. Look at what's really happening. Look at who you really are. Look at what you're really feeling. Look at how imperfect they are. And think about your story. Think about your character. Think about how interesting it is to read about that imperfection. When we reframe situations, we're able to get into that receptive listening mode, the same mode I described in my creativity video. That's the mode that empowers us. That's the mode that enables us to feel things more directly. That's the mode that allows us to be who we are. I would even challenge you to consider that if you don't like who you are, or you don't like the way you're experiencing the world, or you're experiencing your inner landscape, try to reframe it. Try to imagine it differently. Try to think of it having a different meaning. Try to think that there's something going on there that you're not aware of that would make it acceptable to you if you only understood it. If you could only look at it more directly. If you only gave it permission to express itself. If you're getting into dissociative states, it's important to remember that this is not permanent. This is not something that you have to put up with for your entire life. This is something that you can improve or at least transform. There are parts of yourself that are in chrysalis form waiting to come out. And it might take a little bit of struggle, a little bit of effort. But the pain you're experiencing is the pain of transition. It's the pain of growing. It's the pain of coming to accept and familiarize yourself with your new surroundings, with your new inner village, your new inner landscape. Similarly, if your inner landscape is filled with things that you find horrible, if it's filled with monsters, traps, disasters, please understand that these too are subject to transformation. These too can be reframed. It is the act of resisting portions of the inner landscape that renders those portions unnavigable. It is the act of resisting one's true nature that dissociates us. We can reclaim these portions of the inner landscape. We just need to learn to accept that these portions have changed. But we also need to understand that that doesn't mean that they've become ugly, unsafe, or unusable. The chances are that we haven't traversed those parts of the mind for quite some time. We don't really know what's there. All the mechanisms, all the things that we've put there to make it harder for us to go back to those places. All the pain we're experiencing, all the trauma, it's the act of navigating that labyrinth that hurts. It's not those places that we've walled off that hurt. It's the walls themselves. It's the experience of the separation happening to begin with that hurts. It's the feeling of not being whole, of not being complete. It's the feeling of the inner parts no longer communicating. When somebody is dissociated due to trauma, it's usually the things we're doing to try to protect ourselves that are damaging us. And usually this is happening because we're not conscious of the fact that we're doing it. These processes are simply running amok in the background. We can take control of them. We can learn to recognize what's happening. And it's not going to be easy for everybody. It may be very difficult. It may take a lifetime. And there will be several points where we feel like we're going in circles, where we feel like we haven't made any progress at all. But I must remind you, we're spiraling closer to the core, very slowly, rotation by rotation. It might not even feel like progress at first. But it's my hope that we can all be liberated by understanding where that pain truly comes from.